Wonderful. Well, really, really appreciated that. Loads to think about there and to chew on and ponder. So I dare say that it's made us think lots of things, and you may, like me, require a minute or two to sort of let your thoughts percolate and settle. So I'll give people a moment to just sort of think about any questions they have. I've seen someone putting something in the chat already. Holly, feel free to ask your question. It may be sort of directly related to something that Glenn said, or people might have questions that are a slight spin-off, and that's fine. Any questions are welcome. So as I'm just sort of nattering and filling time, feel free to put something in the chat, maybe turn to someone if there's someone with you, or just consider your own thoughts. And in just a minute, I'll sort of kick us off with any questions that are coming in. So have a moment to just sort of consider your thoughts and think of any questions you may have. Wonderful. So thanks, everyone. Holly, like I said, do feel free to ask your question as well. Feel free to type it in or unmute yourself in a second. We've got a question here that's coming from Rosie. Thank you, Glenn. Question, have you ever come across a situation where faith has had a negative effect on mental health?
That's a great question, Rosie. No, thank you for that. Yeah, I think there are all sorts of situations and possibilities for faith actually to have a negative effect, because as comes through in the passage, actually, although Jesus puts it pretty starkly, he says, I am the good shepherd, but then he talks about thieves and who come in, steal and destroy. And there are certainly people who will use faith and have done. Another term that Jesus used was wolves in sheep's clothing, who can really destroy someone's faith through their deceitfulness and their misuse of the power that they have. And we've seen examples of that quite recently, in fact, and they're always deeply disturbing, because somebody says, well, it was the apparent authenticity of that person's life which led me into faith, and now how much of that is valid if it was a house built on sand and it's all collapsed? So there's enormous capacity for harm, given that the faith of the Christian faith is spoken of, is experienced in community, and some of those people in that community may not have the best intentions, or they may be unwise or misunderstand the faith themselves. So one of the ways in which, even with good intentions, I think it's possible to harm is, for example, if somebody is depressed and someone with the best intentions comes along and tells them that, well, of course, we need to be aware of the sin in our hearts and the way that can drag us down, especially undisclosed sin. I've seen that kind of thing. And so someone who's the nature of depression is that you're looking for reasons to blame yourself, to have a down on yourself, to crush yourself. And so somebody comes along, starts talking about your sin and undisclosed sin and so on, and you provide a reason to do that and drive a person down more. And so, the way our faith is talked about at times, I think that can cause harm. It's important to always go back to understand what Jesus says and what the Bible is teaching in its broad context, and always make sure as we teach the Bible that we get the balance of Scripture as well. That's important.
Thank you.
We've got a few questions here, haven't we?
Yeah, they're streaming in. Let's go. I think I'll just have to take them in order. So Question from Claire. For Christians who do have anxiety disorders, depression, OCD, etc., is the focus more likely to be around religion? I guess the focus of those mental health struggles, I suppose, is the focus more likely to be around religion? And would you treat Christians or people of faith in a different way to atheists, as in using different treatment?
Yes. Not necessarily, to be honest, although it can be. The problem with these questions is that, there's so many different kinds of people, so many scenarios, and I hate generalizations. So I want to avoid that. But where faith occupies it, eat it, we go to church a lot, it's a big part of our lives, then my internet connection's unstable. I hope you're hearing me okay. Yep. Then we, it's likely that we'll become anxious about matters of faith, and I think then actually you don't necessarily need a different approach. It can, secular approaches to anxiety can be just as helpful in those situations. What is important is if that you're seeing a secular therapist, and particularly I think in anxiety disorders, I'd always suggest people think about seeing someone who's got expertise in cognitive therapy, a proper professional therapist, even if they're not a Christian themselves, must and should operate within the framework, the worldview of the person they're getting alongside. So they should seek, not to diminish or to in any way to harm one's faith, but simply to work with it if it's happening in that area. So on the whole, yes, it can be, but I don't think it needs different treatment techniques. But it does need a sensitivity to faith, I think.
Thank you, Glyn. Yeah. And I think this connects back to that previous question about harm and whether Christianity can be harmful or religion. So Isabel, Jem and Becca ask, do you think as Christians we're at risk of taking advantage of vulnerable people? As said, a lot of people come to faith in crisis. Are we pushing our beliefs on people when they're vulnerable?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And it's something we've got to be careful about. That we're not exploiting a person's dependency at that point. And our compassion, acts of kindness, our reaching out to someone should be there, whether they respond with faith or not. It has to be genuine compassion. And that's a question for all of our hearts. If it's simply instrumental compassion, in other words, it is designed to produce a particular effect, which is to get this person on board, then it's, that isn't a Christian call, a Christian claim on us. And so we take people as they are, we love them as they are, but of course we can't allow their vulnerability to prevent us from sharing what we feel to be good news and what we feel to be something that will bring benefit to that person. But it's the way we do things. It's always the way we do things, and that we work with a person and, we share our faith. We describe our faith. We don't prescribe it and impose it. And there are differences there, you see.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Sam asks, with the idea of focusing on gratitude aside, although it was helpful, what advice would you give to a Christian with mental health struggles who may find it hard to hear that it's not supposed to be as common as a Christian when it's an issue for them?
Yeah, well, what I'd say is that these are averages. These are effects. These are big data sets in which there's a correlation, you see. And so you could say, for example, we know that people who are at risk of getting serious effects of COVID are people like me, over 70 and male. Okay, so someone comes along who's female, and 30, she says, hang on a minute, this isn't fair. What are you going to say to me? I'm female and 30, and you're telling me, obviously this is an association, it's a risk factor. So someone who finds that hard to hear, I think the only caution any counsel I'd make there is that we live in a world which is quick to take offense in a way. I find that hard to hear. I know that isn't at all what's meant there, but we're always talking about links and associations, and of course, if you're struggling at the time, then that is hard to hear. But we do need to hear it nevertheless. But that in no way should make us feel guilty or especially different or especially weird because it's happened to us, because these are just links. And if you remember, I was careful to say it, and the effect is small to medium. It's not a massive effect, it's a small to medium one. So there'll be quite a few of you, if there's 40 of you there who've struggled with depression or anxiety. I've had anxiety in my own life. And I know how the sheer physicality of anxiety, how it seems to rise up from the very center of your chest and lay claim to you and take you over, and that can make it hard to hear this stuff. And I can see that. And so what I'd say is don't see yourself as being in any way different or especially needy or culpable for having that struggle. Many of us do at different points in our lives. And I think this links with the previous question of what we can do to support one another, or what was the question again? What, as a church, can we do better to support one another's mental health? I think to get the right balance, which is that we don't want to be banging on all the time about being vulnerable and our mental health needs and my problems, because that in itself can become narcissistic for some, or obsessively egocentric for others, or focusing on the self in an unhealthy way. So there's a balance there. But we don't want to be at the other extreme, stiff upper lip, not acknowledging. And so that's why I'm quite happy to acknowledge I've struggled with anxiety at times of my life. I know lots of Christian ministers and leaders who have as well. And so, this is a real issue. So one of the things we can do to encourage mental health is those of us who do struggle, we can share it appropriately. And we don't want the church to get obsessed with it, but in a balanced way, we need to talk about it and share it and get it out on the table.
Thank you so much, Glyn. This has been so helpful for us all individually, I'm sure, and also for those of us who are part of the church family, to think about how we can be that community that you referred to. I've seen that we've just clocked past 8:30, and I'm aware that many people are going to be on screens all day tomorrow and all week. So if you want to kind of clock off and give yourself a breather before getting back to your screen tomorrow morning, then feel completely free. I think we said we'd wrap up at 8:30. But Glyn, if you're happy, if you're not dashing off anywhere, then I may just spring one or two more questions on you, if you don't mind. But people, I hope you've heard that permission to do clock off if you need to. But I'd love to ask you as well. Here we've got a couple more questions. So from Holly, what should we do when what we learn from psychological therapy is different to what God tells us in his word? Is it a case of psychology being only about body and soul without consideration of spirit, and for this reason being incomplete knowledge? Or is having a mental health difficulty seen as perhaps exceptional circumstances when it comes to God's word?
Gosh, that's one I'd love to have a bit more of a conversation about, really, to unpick that question a bit.
If people wanted to contact you another time, that they would be able to?
Not really. I'd get swamped. I'm sorry. It's just I do so much speaking at things, and it would just make life a bit tricky, I'm afraid. But what I can say is, and push back on, if there is the suggestion here, is that there's always one way of looking at things, and we've got to decide whether it's either physical, or is it psychological, or is it spiritual. We've got to get used to the idea that most things are a bit of everything. Okay. As you become a psychiatrist, you have to get used to this, because even as a psychiatrist who isn't looking at things from a spiritual perspective, you have to get used to saying, well, part of this seems to be biological, a biological predisposition. This person's father got depressed. His grandfather got depressed. We know something about the genetics of depression, and that does seem to be a factor here. And so I think an antidepressant may help. But that isn't the whole story, because this is a man who's just retired. And he's the kind of guy who's been in control of a big organization. He's been king of the castle for the past 30 years. Now he finds himself out of things and without a role, and not having really planned for a fruitful retirement. And he's suffered a huge loss, and he's lost. And so whatever the biology that's going on, as the antidepressant lifts him, we want to be doing some work with him as to how he can handle and manage this sense of loss and turn that into something positive. So even as a secular psychiatrist, you have to get used to seeing things from different points of view. And the picture I've used, and I used with medical students, was you think, you look at a room, and it's got a door on one side and a door on the other, and a door on, so it's got 4 doors, this room, okay? If you look through the keyhole, you'll see one side of the room. You go around, look through the keyhole, you see a different picture. And it's a bit like that with psychiatry. It isn't whether it's this or that, it's how much is it this and how much is it that. And you see spiritual issues too. Spiritual issues are also important, because say that man's a Christian, there is a spiritual issue there of how come his role at work has become such a central, controlling, overriding part of his life over these years, that suddenly now he finds that, yeah, he checked in at church, but there's a spiritual hole there, you know? So there's a spiritual issue there as well. And rather than it being one or the other, I always say, how much of this is spiritual and needs pastoral input? And when I lecture clergy, I'm always trying to say, you know, just because a psychiatrist's involved doesn't mean you've given it up to some expert. They're experts in certain perspectives on a problem. You're the one who always brings the spiritual perspective. So just because someone's seeing a professional counselor, that doesn't mean that there's no role for pastoral care and input and ways of looking at life as well. It's a big question that there's lots of ways of responding to it, but that's at least part of the response, I think.
Thank you, Holly's.
I love this one about why are psychotic episodes, delusions, often religious based. Can I say something about that?
Please go ahead.
Well, because this was my particular area of schizophrenia of expertise and psychotic episodes, my heart goes out, you know, to people who, 1 in 100 people, probably 1 in 50 almost, at some point will experience what we call these psychotic symptoms, that is hearing a voice when there's nobody there to account for it, or the formation of a belief which is actually irrational and has no bearing on reality. It's much more common than people think. And once you have one of these symptoms, it is eye-opening, the reality of it. It isn't as if you've heard a voice. You hear a voice. And you can imagine where that voice is cursing you. I've had patients being cursed by voices. You can imagine the hellish experience of that. And we, you know, people who suffer psychosis, and people with bipolar illness usually have shorter term psychosis, and then they get better, wonderfully better. People with schizophrenia, not always, about a third get completely better, but 2/3 do go on to have a much more difficult course. And your heart needs to go out to folk and leave a lot of room and space, passion for helping them find their way in the world, because it's really tough to find your way in the world when your brain isn't making accurate maps of the world, you see. So what's interesting, though, is that psychoses do tend to reflect the cultural preoccupations of the time. And so 100 years ago, people with psychosis were much more centered around being Jesus, being messianic, Satan, the devil. Also, the technology of the time that they were wireless was being, as wireless was invented and became more prevalent in the 20s, 30s, 40s. So you'll be influenced by wireless, you see. And then when television came along, it was more people were looking at you with TV cameras. And then as microchips came along, it was having microchips inserted into my brain. So what is happening is that the disorder of psychosis latches on to the culturally prevalent entities and uses them in its development. And interestingly, I, in my experience, religion has declined as being part of psychotic symptoms over the past 20, 30 years. And people get caught up with spy networks much more, government agencies, those kind of things, but it's still there. And of course, one of the reasons is that, if you're wondering what's going on, if life is, odd things are happening to you, then you will respond in terms of transcendent realities, angels, demons. You will look outside of ordinary reality to what you know that might explain it, these strange experiences you're having beyond reality. And the obvious candidates then are God, the devil, angels, demons. And if you're feeling exhilarated, like mania drives you, it tends to be God and angels. If you're feeling profoundly depressed and dragged into psychosis by depression, it tends to be demons, Satan. And you can see how that happens. So
fascinating, and that beautifully segues onto this final question. I wonder what you make of this, Glyn. In treatment of someone, when would you come to the belief that the case is not straightforward neurological condition, but something with a spiritual? I guess that perhaps relates to what you were saying before, but go ahead. And when do you?
Yeah. I thought I was hoping we'd escape this one today. So here we've got this question of demon possession. Look, I just want to say I was in psychiatry for 35 years, 40 years nearly. And over that time, I did not see someone I would happily say was demon possessed, and that explained what I saw in a single patient over that time. And it's not as if I wasn't aware of it, looking for it. I saw a couple of people that there seemed to be an evil flavor that was so palpable almost. But as they recovered from the mental disorder, it remitted, and both were quite depressed and therefore very preoccupied with themes of evil and darkness. And so that example of demonic possession, I don't think we see very often. And I don't want to discount anybody else's experience. I'm just saying I haven't seen that. And there are two I think the possibility there. One is that demonic activity actually was most active around the time of Jesus, and that as God becomes man, you have this upsurge of demonic powers in human beings at that time, and that it was some reflection at that time of the visitation on earth of the Son of God, and this provoked some kind of demonic encounter, satanic encounter. And it may be that it was more confined to that period. It may be that we are just not seeing so much at the moment for some other reasons that I don't understand. But I'm perfectly happy to accept that this in a world in which I do believe in dark forces, that strange things can happen. Having said that, I don't believe in demonic. I don't believe I've seen demonic possession. Again, I don't go in for this binary way of looking at the world. Is it or isn't it? Dark powers will always exploit suffering. They'll always attempt to darken the picture that's already dark, and hearts that are open to that, they will exploit. And so again, there have been times I've had individuals where, I mean, years and years ago, where people came in, and the pastor and folk from the church wanted to pray with someone, you know, and I said, please pray with someone, and there's no reason why you shouldn't do that, as long as nobody's saying that's the whole story here, that there's nothing more to be done from the mental health side. And so I always encourage people to pray against the work of Satan, to pray against dark forces, whatever the illness, mental or physical, because of course Satan will always exploit where Satan can. So I think I'll stop there. Again, a complicated answer to a good question, though.
Fascinating, and thank you so much, Glyn, for those answers on the spot, off the cuff, and thank you everyone so much for such insightful and interesting questions. Thank you, Glyn, for going on a bit longer than I asked you to as well.
No worries. And can I just say that if there is anybody who's been stirred up a bit and you know, maybe even made a bit more uncomfortable about anxiety or depressive kind of symptoms or struggles there, you know, please don't do this alone. I'd really urge you to get in touch with somebody who can help, and the first point of contact would be your GP, and they can often point you to you know, to a counsellor or some kind of help. And I know that Andy and you, Johnny, and others in the church would be only too happy as well to be contacted. So please don't struggle alone. Do reach out, and thank you for allowing me to share a bit with you tonight.
Thank you, Glyn. Absolutely. Let me just echo that from a church point of view, that we absolutely support going to your GP, and also we are here for you. So whether or not you're sort of a regular amongst us, please feel free to be in touch. If you are regularly amongst us, then you'll know that you know, we have our connect groups, which are sort of the first port of call. But if you ever want to reach out beyond that as well, to a staff member or to anyone else, then please do feel completely free to get in touch with me or Andy or Jules or anyone like that, and we can see how we can best get alongside you.